We're moving on to nucleotides. Now, nucleotide synthesis follows the same kind of concept that we saw in cholesterol synthesis. We are going to use an enormous amount of energy to make a complex ring structure, and then after we're done with it, we're going to throw it away. And so we're going to see a couple of steps in here where we're going to be able to conserve our energy by reutilizing the bases after we make them. So instead of degrading them, we're going to be able to reuse them, much in the way with cholesterol. Cholesterol, we make it, and then only a little bit gets disposed of in the bile secretions, but most of it is recycled so that we don't continually use excess energy to make something that's disposable. So let's move on to nucleotides. Now, we're going to look at several diseases here, and again, the general theme of this, like amino acid defects in synthesis, those tend to cause problems with energy, brain development, because these components are needed for biosynthesis. The deficiencies we're going to see with nucleotide problems, you can pretty much predict are going to be involved in energy, because ATP is a nucleotide, that's our energy source. So if we have problems with making nucleotides, we're going to have problems generating our energy carrier. Or also, of course, cell division. Okay? So cell division requires these bases for replication of DNA and RNA. And so if we have problems with nucleotide synthesis, we're going to have problems with cell replication. So you can imagine the immune system is going to have some difficulty with these diseases. So again, this is the shortcut version that I've come up with for you. Now, let's start at ribose 5-phosphate. And what we're going to look at first is purine synthesis. So remember, purines are adenine and guanine. And the way I remember these, because this is, I'll be honest with you, this is one of my most hated subjects in biochemistry, is nucleotide synthesis. So hence why I've come up with a shortcut. How do you remember the structures of these so that if you see a base, you'll know instantly if it's a purine or a pyrimidine? Pretty simple, huh? That's a purine. Now that's not exactly adenine or guanine, because the only difference between these two are substitutions of chemical groups around the ring. But they both have the same ring structure. Okay? So how do we make a purine? The first thing we need to do is start with the carbohydrate. The carbohydrate, of course, is a 5-carbon ribose structure. And we need ribose 5-phosphate to start with. And where does this come from? The shunt. The shunt. Pentose phosphate pathway. I know, that's right? Pentose phosphate pathway. So we've been able to get by the glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, which is making our NADPH. And at the end of the pentose phosphate pathway, we are having ribose 5-phosphate. Now here's a real tricky conundrum for you. What happens if we have a high concentration of NADPH and it inhibits this enzyme and we still need ribose sugars? Oh man, now what do we do? Malic enzyme. No, that's NADPH. You're right with NADPH, that's our backup. But Remember, if we don't need ribose, what happens to this?
It's broken down.
It's broken down. Yeah, we're going to send this back to glycolysis. The enzymes that do this,
Transaldolases.
yeah, transaldolase and transketolase. What if I was to tell you that these transaldolase and transketolases are completely reversible enzymes?
You're telling us the truth. I believe you.
You believe me? That is the truth. So if we have a block on the pentose phosphate pathway, we can take our substrates for this synthesis from glycolysis and reverse this reaction. And that way we can get around the block because of the NADPH on the dehydrogenase enzyme. Is that way cool? We have ways to get around these blocks. So now we have ribose 5-phosphate. Then we are going to synthesize PRPP. Remember I mentioned this before. This is phosphoribosyl pyrophosphate. The enzyme that does this reaction is called PRPP synthetase. Now, when we were in the pentose phosphate pathway, we got to the ribose 5-phosphate, and I mentioned this has two directions. One is to return back to glycolysis to use these for energy, because we're not going to need them, or we can use this to go into nucleotide synthesis. And remember I said it was dependent on this enzyme. This enzyme is the rate-limiting entrance step, and it's the regulated step into nucleotide synthesis. So we'll see in a second how that's regulated, but let's make our purines. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the PRPP. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to modify this to put a nitrogen on the sugar. Once we have the nitrogen, this is a real shortcut here. Once we have the nitrogen on the ribose sugar, then what we're going to do is we are going to build the purine ring structure on that nitrogen. So we're going to build this ring structure on that nitrogen. And what we're going to end up with is a molecule that's the ribose carbohydrate, and we're going to have our purine ring on it. And this particular structure is going to be called inosine monophosphate. So both of the adenine and guanine molecules are going to be coming from a common precursor. So the first thing we do is get our PRPP. We're going to activate that with a nitrogen on the ring that's going to be the first nitrogen to start building the ring. We're going to build the ring on this structure. Once we have this, it's called inosine monophosphate. Now, from here, there's several steps. And these steps are only modifications around this ring to give us AMP or GMP. Adenosine monophosphate or guanosine monophosphate. Okay, so now, here's where the regulation gets really cool. The first thing is what I said back in the pentose phosphate pathway. We need to control the entrance of ribose 5-phosphate because once we go past this point, we are committed. So if we don't need the nucleotide synthesis, let's stop this step right there so that we can build up our substrate back here, our ribose 5-phosphate, but we have a way out. We have an escape route for it to put it into glycolysis, so it's not going to build up to toxic levels. So what's a great way to regulate that enzyme? Yeah, feedback. So the GMP and the AMP will feed back and inhibit the synthetase enzymes. Now here's something else that's really cool. When we're doing, let's go back to Dr. Baer. When we're doing DNA replication, you've got your DNA polymerase trundling down the template. It's waiting for bases to come in order to match the complementary base and make your DNA strand. What happens if you have an imbalance of your bases? So for example, what happens if you have 10 times the concentration of one base as you do another? What does that lead to?
It's just going to pop in the wrong one and lead to mutation.
Right, exactly. It's going to pop into the wrong one because you're overwhelming the concentration of the other one, so there's going to be a competitive problem, and the polymerase's editing function is going to be really good, but it's not going to be perfect. And so you're going to do a mismatch base repair in there. So now, how do we prevent that in normal cells? We need to control the amount of synthesis of each one of our nucleotides. So in this case, the AMP will go back at high concentrations and inhibit its own synthesis. What's that going to do to the inosine monophosphate? Push it into GMP. So if we have high AMP, low GMP, the AMP will block this and push that back into GMP so that we start getting equal amount of purine bases. What if we have high GMP and low AMP? Just the opposite. So they have a counter-regulatory function, and the sole purpose of that is to make sure that the inosine monophosphate is moving into the synthesis pathways in a balanced fashion. Okay. Okay, did that. Shortcuts making sense so far? You notice I got chemistry on here on how to do it. Again, that's the path. If you want to actually see the modifications of the bases, I put them on here for you. But none of that is testable. This is what you need to know. Okay, so that is purine biosynthesis in a nutshell. So let's move on to pyrimidine. Okay, these are our pyrimidines. These are going to look like this. Wow. That was just really bad. Wasn't that awful? Wait, I drew that? That's not much better. But they're going to look like that. So they're just going to have a single 6-membered ring to them. Now for these, we are going to also need our ribose 5-phosphate, our PRPP synthetase enzyme. We'll make this into PRPP, but this is going to be held aside for a moment. For pyrimidines, what we're going to do is we are going to build the ring separate from PRPP. Once we build this final ring structure, this is biochemistry humor. This is the biochemist's contribution to the 50 Shades of Grey. Yeah, exactly, right? That's why I apologize first. This is biochemistry humor. We spend too much time in our labs. We don't get out and socialize as much. So we're going to make orotate, orotic acid. Now,
That's pretty good.
at this point here, once we make the orotic acid, this is the end of making the ring structure for the pyrimidines. The next step on here is to add the sugar. We're going to add the pyrimidine onto the ribose sugar using PRPP. Now here is a disease state. If this gets blocked, and this enzyme is, I listed it on here, orotate phosphoribosyl transferase. I would never test you on the name of that. But if you get a block here, you are going to lead to orotate aciduria. Excessive orotate in the urine. Okay, so this is a diagnostic if you suspect that there is a nucleotide metabolism error. If you detect that there's high levels of orotate in the urine, then you know that the block is right here and you're building up the orotate intermediate. Now this also, of course, is going to cause developmental problems because what you're doing here is by this block, you're preventing all pyrimidine synthesis. And so you're going to be deficient on all of these bases for cell replication. So again, profound developmental problems. So now, once we get by this block, if everything is normal, we're going to have our pyrimidine ribose here, and we are going to do some modifications around the ring, and we are going to generate UMP, uridine monophosphate. Okay. Now, from this point here, from uridine monophosphate, we can make our other bases. And once we have this, we have our full complement of pyrimidine bases that we need. Now, I've been drawing these as the monophosphate form. This is what's actually needed. Of course, UTP is just for RNA synthesis. But we're going to need the triphosphate form because that's the energy form that's going to be used to make the polymer of DNA or RNA. There are separate reactions that go on between here that do this. You don't have to worry about them, but just recognize that we have to go from the mono to triphosphate form. Now, these are all the ribose molecules for RNA. How do we make DNA? Because DNA, we need this. What's that D stand for? Deoxyform. And so it's a rather complicated little pathway about how this is done. But there's one enzyme that's responsible. And it's called ribonucleotide reductase. And this enzyme is responsible for removing that hydroxyl group on the number 2 carbon of the ribose ring and making it a hydrogen to make it in the deoxy form. And then all of these can be used for DNA synthesis, whereas the rest of these are all for RNA. Okay, so this is kind of again, a watered down version, but just the basic elements that you need. We good with synthesis? Move on to degradation. Okay, so degrading. So once we make something, we have to have the ability to degrade these. Now, in order to degrade a pyrimidine, I start with this one because this is the easiest one. Our pyrimidine molecule remember, the differences between our different pyrimidines are just changes in chemical structure around the ring, but the ring structure is the same. So pyrimidine degradation is going to involve modifications around the ring. So that means there's just going to be chemical changes to this ring. Sort of like a P450 enzyme that's just going to do modifications to the structure. Then, once we do that, this will be excreted. And that's because this molecule, after we process it, is very soluble. And so there's absolutely no problems, no disorders, nothing with pyrimidine degradation. We just do a little bit of chemistry on it and send it out. Purine degradation is a little bit more complicated. So remember our basic structure. That's our basic ring structure of our guanine and adenine. And the first thing that we're going to do with the purine base, which is of course going to have the ribose on it, is going to be the same thing I forgot to mention about the pyrimidines. We got to take the ribose off. So the first reaction is to get rid of the ribose. And then we're left with the base plus the ribose sugar. So ribose comes off first, and then we can start working on this base. Now the base, we've got two different directions. One is the guanine base. We're going to do, again, the same thing we did with the pyrimidines. We're not going to change the ring structure because we don't have any enzymes that can actually crack these rings. They will always stay intact. So all we're going to do is modify this structure around the edge, and now we're going to change the guanine of this base into xanthine. The other one is adenine, the other purine base. This will be converted in a couple of steps into hypoxanthine. After it's become hypoxanthine, we've got one more reaction that takes it into xanthine. Now the xanthine has one more step it's going to take, and that's uric acid. So I think most of you probably know where I'm going with this. The enzyme that performs the hypoxanthine to xanthine reaction is called xanthine oxidase. It also performs the reaction of xanthine to uric acid. Now, under normal conditions, let's talk about disease. Under normal conditions, this works just fine. The uric acid is excreted into urine. But every now and then you get these primarily old guys that start having a problem with their big toes. Sometimes they'll have problems with their joints of their hands and the elbows, but it primarily shows up in the big toe. And what are those?
Gout.
Gouts, yeah. More technically, it's called urate crystals, and that leads to the condition of gout. So what's happening here is that uric acid is not very soluble. And if you're producing small amounts of uric acid because you have small amounts of purine degradation going through, and you're young and you've got really nice kidneys, this is not a problem having a little bit of insolubility problem. But as you age, and or you make more degradation products of purine, the amount of uric acid starts to go up. Because of this level of insolubility, it is going to precipitate in very, very inconvenient places, like the big toe. The reason for that is because it's going to precipitate where blood flow is reduced, the extremities. And if you have reduced blood flow, you have the chance of increasing the chance of precipitation because of reduced flow, and you start forming these urate crystals. Now this is technically called gouty arthritis. And that's because these crystals tend to precipitate in the bones, in the joints. Allopurinol, yeah. Allopurinol.
I like the amputation idea. We'll get rid of it.
So allopurinol is the miracle drug for gout. And it works just beautifully. There's pretty much very few little side effects. And what it does is it blocks xanthine oxidase activity. So by blocking xanthine oxidase activity, you're going to increase the concentrations of xanthine and hypoxanthine. Now at this point, you gotta say, wait a minute, what was I just talking about? That if you block something, you're gonna build up toxic intermediates. Well, the advantage here are these two are very soluble. So all you're doing is you're changing the chemistry of the degradation products. You're going from a product that is rather insoluble to cause these crystals to something that is very soluble, and then these can be secreted clearly into the urine. The salvage pathway. What the salvage pathway is really designed for energy conservation. And this is just super easy, and you're going to love this. So you've got your purines on your ribose structure. You've got your pyrimidines on your ribose structure. So what we just got through talking about was to remove the ribose and then degrade the bases. here's the more prevalent pathway that we have in the body. We are going to remove the ribose. And then we're going to modify these down a little bit. The purines will be modified down to hypoxanthine. Plus guanine. And then once we get to this point where we have a free pyrimidine and a free hypoxanthine guanine, we're going to do this. We're going to add a ribose back on that comes from PRPP. For the purines, again, we have to do some modifications to make the adenine and guanine. And we get back to the starting point. Now, the advantage here is that we have not had to remake the ring structures of the bases. And so this saves an enormous amount of energy. This much energy. So de novo synthesis of GMP requires lots of ATP, 12 steps, and a lot of precursors that have to go into the construction of this that are being taken out of the energy pathway. Look at the salvage pathway. One step. No ATP used. No precursors coming out of the energy pathway. So that's why this is called the salvage pathway. It allows us to take all of our nucleotides, cleave off the ribose structure, and then recycle these bases if we need them, or degrade them. And this is what we mostly do under most conditions. And this is the subject of our case today. So in Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, this enzyme is deficient. So what that leads to is a block in Lesch-Nyhan here, so that we cannot use the salvage pathway for pyrimidines. What that really means also here is that we have an increase in hypoxanthine and guanine. So this leads, Lesch-Nyhan is a horrific disease that leads to self-mutilation. But there is one other accompanying symptom that follows Lesch-Nyhan very closely, and that's the conversion of this to xanthine and onto uric acid. So individuals with Lesch-Nyhan syndrome also have very difficult problems with gout. Because without the salvage pathway, the only place for these purine structures is into the degradation pathway. And so you're increasing the flux of these purines into that pathway and dramatically increasing the concentration of your uric acid, leading to gout. Now there's one other thing about pyrimidines. No, forget about the pyrimidines. We're not going to go there. There's no disease related to that, so forget that. So the purines, as you're processing the purines, you're fine going down here to guanine, of course, But the processing down here to hypoxanthine is going to have to go through adenine. So this pathway down here is guanine. Now adenine, after you cleave off the ribose structure, the first thing that you need to do on this to get down to the hypoxanthine structure is remove a nitrogen. The enzyme that does that is called adenine deaminase. And I bring that to your attention because there's another disease there. So deficiency in this enzyme causes SID. Skid. SID. SID, skid. Skid. Works. Severe combined immunodeficiency. Why would this lead to an immunodeficiency?
Adenosine is toxic to lymphocytes.
Adenosine is toxic, and you're also going to be blocking the salvage pathway progression. And so you're going to increase degradation of it, and so you're going to be having difficulty getting this adenine in a sufficient enough quantity for cellular replication. Because once we get this adenine structure made, remember the purine bases during biosynthesis have to be made on the sugar. So once we have adenine cleaved off the sugar, the only way to reuse this is to go through the salvage pathway. Otherwise, we have to degrade it. Now, we've got to backpedal just a little bit. We have to backpedal back to fructose metabolism, primarily because not only does fructose, hereditary fructose intolerance cause the normal clinical symptoms you're used to, but this also causes hyperuricemia, which can manifest into gout. So what's the connection here? Well, we have our fructose. This is being taken up by GLUT5 in the liver. Fructokinase converts this into fructose 1-phosphate. Then this is converted into glyceraldehyde and DHAP by the enzyme aldolase A or B? E. Now we saw that if we have a mutation here in fructokinase, this leads to milder symptoms because we have an escape route for fructose. If the enzyme is deficient, we will not create fructose 1-phosphate so that this fructose can go back out through GLUT5. Mild disease. What about a mutation in aldolase B? Devastating, very severe disease. So this is going to prevent the processing of fructose 1-phosphate. The fructokinase is an ATP-dependent reaction, so that means the conversion of this is not reversible. So again, we've got a buildup of a toxic intermediate here. Fructose 1-phosphate starts to build up. So we have our osmotic problems, but what else do we have? Remember the other problem?
Phosphates.
Phosphate, yeah. We're tying up all of our phosphate because as fructose keeps coming in, we're keep using ATP and binding the phosphate covalently to fructose so it's no longer available to make ATP. So our phosphate levels, our inorganic phosphate levels, start to decline. Now, as a result of this particular reaction, the ATP is turning into ADP. The ADP has no place to go. We can't make ATP out of it because our phosphate levels are down. So we have another reaction that we can turn this into AMP. Now, as AMP starts building up, again, we can't do anything with it, we are going to be pushing this into the adenosine degradation, the purine degradation pathway. And so ultimately, through all of those other reactions, we are going to be increasing our concentrations of xanthine, which in turn increases our concentration of uric acid. So if we have a mutation in aldolase B, the primary problem is the fructose 1-phosphate, but secondary to this, we have the problem with hyperuricemia because we're pushing that excess adenosine into the degradation pathway.